In a small town tucked away in the Midwest, life moved at its own unhurried pace. The streets were lined with modest homes, and neighbors knew each other by name. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but for one woman, this place felt like home. She was a single mother of 2 young kids doing her best to build a stable life despite the cards she'd been dealt. Every morning she woke up before sunrise to get ready for work. Her job as a nurse at the local hospital kept her busy, but it also gave her purpose. She loved caring for people, even when they weren't always kind in return. After long shifts, she'd rush home to spend time with her children, 2 bright-eyed, little ones who depended on her for everything. They didn't have much, but laughter filled their tiny house, and love held them together. She tried hard to shield her kids from the harsher sides of life. Growing up Black in America meant facing challenges that others might never understand. From subtle comments at school events to outright discrimination while shopping, she'd learned early on how to navigate a world that often seemed stacked against her. But she refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, she poured all her energy into creating a safe space for her family, a bubble where racism couldn't touch them. One evening after finishing a double shift at the hospital, she stopped by the grocery store to pick up essentials. Her cart was filled with cereal, milk, bread, and snacks her kids had been begging for. As she loaded the bags into her car, exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders, but there was no time to rest. Her kids would be waiting for her back home. The drive home should have been uneventful. The roads were quiet, and the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. But just as she turned onto a familiar street, flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Confused, she pulled over, her heart skipping a beat. Had she done something wrong? She racked her brain, trying to figure out what could have caught the attention of the police. 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car, their boots crunching against the gravel as they approached her window. "License and registration," one of them barked, his tone sharp and accusatory. She nodded quickly, reaching for her documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely, hoping to diffuse whatever tension hung in the air. But instead of answering, the officer leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't see the sign back there?" he snapped. "Your taillight's out." She blinked in surprise. A broken taillight? That was it? Still, she forced herself to stay calm. Arguing wouldn't help. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. "I'm sorry about that," she said softly. "I'll get it fixed as soon as I can." Her apology didn't seem to matter. Without warning, the officer slammed his hand down on her car window, cracking it. Fear shot through her veins as he yanked open her door and dragged her out onto the pavement. Her kids screamed from the back seat, their voices piercing through the chaos. "Mommy, what's happening?" The second officer joined in, shouting accusations and insults laced with racial slurs. Panic surged inside her, but she tried to remain composed. This wasn't the first time she'd faced unfair treatment because of the color of her skin, but it had never escalated like this. Why were they treating her like a criminal? All she'd done was pull over when they told her to. As the situation spiraled out of control, her mind raced. She needed help, and fast. Then, amidst the confusion and pain, she remembered someone who could make a difference, someone powerful, someone who cared deeply about justice. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, praying it wasn't too late. Little did those officers know, their actions were about to set off a chain reaction that would change everything. For her, for them, and for countless others watching from afar. As the 2 officers towered over her, their voices grew louder, each word laced with hostility. She stood there, hands shaking, trying to keep herself together. Her mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. The kids in the back seat were still crying, their small voices trembling as they called out for her. It broke her heart to hear them so scared, but she couldn't let herself fall apart. Not now. One of the officers grabbed her arm roughly, twisting it behind her back. "You think you're special?" he sneered, his grip tightening. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she bit her lip to stop herself from crying out. She knew better than to show weakness. Showing fear or pain often made things worse. It was a lesson she'd learned the hard way growing up. But this time felt different. This wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. And it was happening right in front of her children. The second officer circled around the car, peering into the back seat where her kids sat wide-eyed and terrified. He smirked, muttering something under his breath that sounded like, "Probably troublemakers too." His words stung more than any physical blow could. These were her babies, her pride and joy. How dare he judge them without even knowing them? Anger bubbled inside her, but she swallowed it down. Fighting back wouldn't help, not here, not now. "Why are you doing this?" she finally managed to ask, her voice steady, despite the storm raging inside her. "I didn't do anything wrong." Her question only seemed to infuriate them further. The first officer shoved her against the side of the car, pressing her face close to the cold metal. "Don't talk back," he snarled. "You'll do what we say when we say it." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She thought about all the times she'd taught her kids to stand tall, no matter what life threw at them. What kind of example would she be setting if she crumbled now? Still, the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She felt trapped, powerless, and utterly alone. But then through the haze of fear and pain, a spark of hope flickered in her mind. There was someone who could help, someone who had always been there for her, no matter what. Her older brother, the one person in the world she trusted completely. He wasn't just family, he held a position of immense power and influence. If anyone could put an end to this madness, it was him. With her free hand, she fumbled for her phone in her pocket. The officers were too focused on intimidating her to notice. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked the screen and scrolled through her contacts. She hesitated for a split second, wondering if calling him would make things worse. Would they retaliate if they found out? Could she risk putting her brother in danger too? But then she remembered something he'd once told her. "No one gets to treat you like you're less than human, not ever." Those words echoed in her mind, giving her the courage to press the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then she heard his voice on the other end. Instantly, she felt a surge of relief, like a lifeline had been thrown to her in the middle of a raging sea. "Hey," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need your help. Please." On the other end, her brother's tone shifted immediately. He went from casual to sharp in an instant. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice low and urgent. She could hear the concern in his voice, but also the steel beneath it, the same determination that had carried him to the top of his field. She tried to explain, her words tumbling out in a rush. "They pulled me over. They're hurting me. I don't know what to do." Her voice cracked, and she hated how fragile she sounded, but her brother didn't hesitate. "I'm on it," he said firmly. "Stay strong, just a little longer." Hearing his reassurance gave her strength, even as the officers continued their assault. One of them noticed the phone in her hand and snatched it away, snapping, "Who are you talking to?" "It's none of your business," she shot back, surprising even herself with her boldness. For a moment the officer looked taken aback, but then his expression darkened. He flipped through her recent calls, clearly looking for answers. When he saw the name on the screen, a name that carried weight, he froze. For the first time since the ordeal began, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He glanced at his partner, who shrugged, though his usual bravado seemed to waver slightly. Whatever they had expected, this wasn't it. And that's when she realized something important. Her brother wasn't just coming to save her. He was going to expose the truth. The thought filled her with a strange mix of fear and hope. Fear because she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Hope because maybe, just maybe, this could be the moment when things finally changed. For her kids, and for everyone else who had faced similar injustices. As the officers muttered amongst themselves, she straightened her posture, wiping the tears from her cheeks. She didn't know exactly what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain: she wasn't backing down. Not anymore. The moment the officer saw the name on her phone screen, his face changed. For a split second, he looked like a deer caught in headlights, his earlier bravado crumbling into uncertainty. He glanced at his partner, who was pacing near the car, and then back at her. The tension in the air shifted. It was subtle, but she noticed it immediately. Something about that name had shaken him. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the officer hesitate. She didn't know exactly what he was thinking, but she could guess. Her brother wasn't just anyone. His position carried weight, enough to make even the most arrogant people think twice before crossing him. And now these officers were realizing they had picked the wrong person to mess with. "Who is this?" the officer demanded, holding up her phone. His voice was sharp, but there was an edge of nervousness to it now. She stared at him, refusing to answer. Let him figure it out himself. After everything they'd done to her, she owed them nothing. Not explanations, not apologies, not fear. Her silence only seemed to unnerve him further. He muttered something under his breath and stepped away from her, pulling out his own radio. "We might have a situation here," he said into it, his tone clipped. Whatever response came crackled faintly through the device, but she couldn't make out the words. All she knew was that the dynamic had shifted. They weren't in control anymore. Meanwhile, miles away, her brother sprang into action. As soon as he hung up the phone, he moved with a purpose that few people ever saw. This wasn't just personal. It was professional. He cared deeply for his sister, yes, but he also understood the bigger picture. If this incident went unchecked, it would be another example of power misused. Another story swept under the rug. That wasn't going to happen. Not on his watch. He made a series of rapid calls, starting with his closest allies within the organization he led. Each conversation was brief but intense. "I need eyes on this now," he said firmly during one call. "No delays, no excuses." To another contact, he added, "Get me everything you can on those officers, past complaints, disciplinary records, anything. I want the full picture." Word spread quickly among his team. Within minutes, federal agents were mobilized, heading straight for the small town where she was being held. These weren't ordinary cops. They were highly trained professionals who understood the gravity of the situation. Their arrival wouldn't just protect her, it would send a message. No one, not even law enforcement, was above accountability. Back at the scene, time seemed to stretch endlessly. The officers grew increasingly agitated as they waited for instructions. One of them kept glancing down the road, clearly expecting backup, or maybe dreading it. The other paced back and forth, muttering angrily to himself. Neither of them looked at her directly anymore, as if avoiding eye contact might somehow erase what they'd done. Her kids were still in the back seat, their cries quieter now, but no less heartbreaking. She wanted nothing more than to go to them, to hold them close and tell them everything would be okay. But she couldn't move, not yet. So instead, she focused on staying strong, drawing strength from the knowledge that help was coming. And then finally, she heard it. The distant sound of sirens. At first, the officers perked up, assuming it was their colleagues arriving to support them. But as the vehicles came closer, their expressions fell. The flashing lights weren't red and blue. They were marked with insignias she recognized, instantly. Federal agents. Her brother's people. When the first agent stepped out of the lead vehicle, the change in atmosphere was palpable. Gone was the chaos and hostility that had defined the past few minutes. In its place was a cold, calculated calm. The agent approached the scene with authority, his gaze sweeping over the officers, the damaged car, and finally, her. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice firm but controlled. The officers stammered, trying to explain themselves, but their words came out jumbled and defensive. She didn't say anything at first, letting the scene speak for itself. Her torn clothes, the blood trickling down her cheek, the shattered car window. It was all the evidence anyone needed. The agent turned to her next, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her body ached and her throat felt raw from holding back tears. "Help is here," he assured her. Those three simple words brought a wave of relief so powerful it nearly knocked her off her feet. As the agents took charge of the situation, The officers' demeanor shifted completely. Gone was the aggression, replaced by panic. They started throwing accusations at each other, trying to shift blame. One of them even attempted to argue that they were just doing their job, but their protests fell flat. Everyone present knew the truth. Her brother arrived shortly after, stepping out of a sleek black SUV with a look of quiet fury etched onto his face. When he saw her standing there, battered but unbroken, his shoulders sagged with a mix of anger and relief. He crossed the distance between them in a few quick strides, pulling her into a tight embrace. For the first time since the ordeal began, she let herself cry, silent tears streaming down her face as she clung to him. "I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She shook her head, unable to find the words to respond. What could she say? That it was okay? That she forgave him for not being able to prevent this? None of that mattered right now. All that mattered was that she was safe, and that justice was finally within reach. As the agents handcuffed the officers and placed them in the back of a patrol car, she allowed herself a small smile. This wasn't the end of her fight, not by a long shot, but it was a start. With her brother by her side and the full force of the law behind her, she knew they could take on whatever came next. Together, the arrival of the federal agents turned the scene into something out of a movie. One moment, the two officers were barking orders and throwing their weight around, convinced they were untouchable. The next, they were scrambling to explain themselves, their confidence crumbling like sandcastles hit by a wave. It was clear that they hadn't expected this kind of response. No one did when power was suddenly flipped on its head. Her brother stood at the center of it all, his presence commanding without him having to say much. He didn't shout or make grand gestures. Instead, he let his actions speak for him. Every instruction he gave was calm but firm, every decision deliberate. To the officers, it must have felt like staring into the eye of a storm, a quiet, unrelenting force that refused to back down. As the agents took over, her brother turned his attention to her. His eyes scanned her face, taking in the cuts, bruises, and the exhaustion etched deep into her features. She could see the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. It wasn't just directed at the officers who had hurt her, but also at himself, for not being there sooner. But she didn't want him feeling guilty. All that mattered now was that he was here. "Let's get you checked out," he said softly, guiding her toward one of the vehicles. She hesitated, glancing back at her kids still sitting wide-eyed in the back seat of her car. They looked so small, so scared, clutching each other as if holding on for dear life. "What about them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're coming with us," he replied immediately. "We'll take care of everything." Relief washed over her as she nodded. For the first time since the nightmare began, she allowed herself to believe things might actually be okay. The ride to the hospital was quiet, save for the occasional sniffle from the kids. Her brother sat beside her, his arm protectively draped over her shoulders. He didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless words or empty reassurances. Instead, he simply stayed close, letting her lean on him when the weight of everything became too much to bear. That simple act of solidarity meant more than any speech ever could. At the hospital, doctors examined her injuries while social workers gently spoke with the kids, ensuring they were physically and emotionally unharmed. Her brother stayed by her side throughout, fielding calls and coordinating with his team. Each update he received seemed to fuel his determination even further. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about accountability, transparency, and making sure something like this never happened again. News of the incident spread quickly. By the time she was discharged from the hospital, videos of the traffic stop had already gone viral online. A bystander had captured part of the altercation on their phone, and within hours the footage was everywhere. News outlets, social media, platforms, community forums. People were outraged, demanding answers and justice. Hashtags like #Enough is enough and "Justice for her" started trending nationwide. For her, seeing strangers rally behind her story was both overwhelming and humbling. At first, she avoided looking at the comments, afraid of what she might find. But then her brother showed her some of the messages people had sent. They weren't just angry. They were supportive, encouraging, and filled with love. One comment stood out. "Your courage is inspiring. We see you and we stand with you." It brought tears too. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity, emotions, and decisions. Her story had become a national talking point, sparking debates on news channels, social media platforms, and dinner tables across the country. People couldn't stop discussing what had happened to her, how two officers sworn to protect and serve had instead brutalized a single mother in front of her children. The outrage was palpable, but so was the hope. For many, this felt like a turning point, a moment when society might finally confront the deep-rooted issues within law enforcement. Her brother worked tirelessly behind the scenes, ensuring no stone was left unturned in the investigation. He coordinated with federal agencies, civil rights organizations, and legal experts to build a case against the officers involved. Every piece of evidence mattered: the bystander's video, medical reports documenting her injuries, witness statements from neighbors who had seen parts of the altercation, and he made sure nothing slipped through the cracks. His focus wasn't just on punishing those responsible. It was about exposing the systemic failures that allowed such abuse to happen in the first place. But as much as he shielded her from the chaos, she couldn't escape the weight of public attention. Reporters camped outside her house, eager for an interview or even a glimpse of her face. Friends and family called constantly, offering support but also asking questions she didn't feel ready to answer. Strangers sent letters and messages, some filled with love and encouragement, others laced with criticism or doubt. One letter accused her of exaggerating the incident for attention. Another suggested she should forgive the officers because they're only human. Reading those words stung, but they also reminded her why this fight was important, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed or silenced. Despite the noise around her, she found moments of peace at home. Her kids clung to her more than ever, seeking reassurance that everything would be okay. She spent hours holding them, reading bedtime stories and letting them talk about their feelings. They didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew enough to feel scared. "Mommy, will those bad men come back?" her youngest asked one night, tears streaming down their cheeks. She hugged them tightly, promising over and over again that she wouldn't let anyone hurt them. It broke her heart to see her children carrying this fear, but it also fueled her determination to make things right. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch watching her kids play in the yard, her brother joined her. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, shoulders slumped, but there was a fire in his gaze that hadn't dimmed since the day she called him for help. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently, handing her a cup of tea. She sighed, staring out at her children. "I don't know," she admitted. "Some days I feel strong, like I can take on the world. Other days, it's hard to get out of bed." He nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "It's okay to feel both," he said. "This isn't something you have to rush through, but I need you to know you're not alone. We're going to get through this together." His words brought tears to her eyes, though she tried to blink them away before he noticed. She appreciated his unwavering support, but she also felt guilty relying on him so heavily. "You've already done so much," she murmured. "I don't want to drag you into all of this." "You didn't drag me into anything," he replied firmly. "This is my fight too, and it's bigger than us. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what you did." That conversation stayed with her long after he left. Bigger than them. That phrase echoed in her mind, reminding her that her experience wasn't isolated. Countless others had faced similar injustices, often without the resources or platform to fight back. If she could use her voice to amplify theirs, maybe, just maybe, something good could come out of all this pain. A few days later, she received an invitation to speak at a community rally organized by local activists. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't her thing. and the thought of standing in front of hundreds of people terrified her. What if she froze? What if she said the wrong thing? But then she remembered her kids, huddled together in the back seat of her car during the traffic stop, crying for her. She owed it to them and to herself to try. When the day of the rally arrived, nerves threatened to overwhelm her. As she stood backstage, listening to the crowd cheer for the speakers before her, she felt her hands tremble. Her brother appeared beside her, squeezing her shoulder reassuringly. "You've got this," he whispered. "Just tell your truth." Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the stage. The sea of faces staring back at her was overwhelming, but she focused on the ones closest to the front, activists, friends, and strangers holding signs that read, "Justice for all and no more silence." Slowly, she began to speak, her voice shaky, at first but growing stronger with each word. "I never imagined I'd be here today," she started, pausing to steady herself. "I'm just a mom trying to raise my kids and live my life. But one night everything changed. 2 officers treated me like I was less than human, all because of the color of my skin." The crowd erupted into murmurs of anger and disbelief, but she pressed on. "What happened to me isn't unique. It happens every day all over this country to people who look like me. Most of them don't have cameras rolling or someone powerful to call for help. Their stories stay hidden, ignored, or swept under the rug." Her voice cracked as she continued, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But we can't let that happen anymore. We deserve better. Our kids deserve better. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. Together we can demand justice. Together we can create change." By the time she finished, the crowd was on its feet, cheering and chanting her name. She stepped back from the microphone, overwhelmed but grateful. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of purpose, a glimmer of light cutting through the darkness. As she walked off stage, her brother enveloped her in a hug. "That was incredible," he said, his voice thick with pride. "You just inspired thousands of people." She smiled faintly, wiping her tears. "I hope so," she replied, softly. "Because we're just getting started." The momentum from the rally didn't fade. It grew stronger with each passing day. Her speech had struck a chord, not just locally, but across the nation. Clips of her heartfelt words played on repeat on news channels, social media platforms, and even late-night talk shows. People couldn't stop talking about her courage, her vulnerability, and her call for action. It was as if she'd tapped into something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years, a collective frustration and longing for change. Her brother continued to push forward with the investigation, determined to ensure accountability at every level. The 2 officers involved in the incident were formally charged with multiple offenses, including assault, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. But it didn't stop there. A deeper dive into their records revealed a pattern of misconduct, complaints filed by other citizens accusing them of excessive force, racial profiling, and abuse of power. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a disturbing trend that had gone unchecked for far too long. As the case unfolded, her story became a catalyst for broader conversations about systemic racism within law enforcement. Activists, lawmakers, and community leaders seized the opportunity to demand reforms. Town hall meetings sprang up everywhere, giving people a platform to share their own experiences of injustice. Some stories mirrored hers, routine traffic stops escalating into terrifying ordeals. Others were different but equally heartbreaking. Wrongful arrests, unjustified shootings, families torn apart by unchecked authority. She attended some of these events, finding strength in solidarity. At one meeting, an elderly woman stood up and recounted how her son had died during a police encounter decades ago. "We never got justice," the woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But maybe now, because of you, someone else will." Those words stuck with her. She realized that while her situation was unique in its details, it was also part of a much larger narrative, one that spanned generations. For so long, countless voices had been ignored or silenced. Now, Finally, they were being heard, and she felt a responsibility to amplify them. Her brother encouraged her to keep speaking out, knowing her platform could help drive meaningful change. Together, they began working with advocacy groups to draft policy proposals aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in policing. They pushed for measures like mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, and stricter consequences for officers found guilty of misconduct. Their efforts gained traction quickly, earning support from both sides of the political aisle. Lawmakers who had once dismissed calls for reform suddenly found themselves under pressure to act. But not everyone welcomed the changes. Critics argued that focusing on individual cases like hers painted an unfair picture of law enforcement as a whole. Most officers are good people doing duty. The trial dragged on for weeks, each day bringing new revelations and raw emotions. The courtroom became a battleground of truths, lies, and memories that refused to fade. Every witness who took the stand added another layer to the story. Some spoke with anger, others with sorrow, but all carried the weight of what had happened that night. For her, sitting through it all was exhausting. It felt like reliving the trauma over and over again, except this time, she wasn't alone. Her brother stayed by her side every step of the way, his presence steady and grounding. One of the hardest moments came when the prosecution played the bystanders' video in court. The footage was grainy, shot from a distance, but it captured enough to make everyone in the room gasp. You could see the officers dragging her out of the car, hear their raised voices and harsh words. The image of her crumpling to the ground made her kids cry softly beside her, clutching her hands as if trying to pull her back into the present. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breathing before opening them again to face the truth head-on. This wasn't just evidence. It was proof that what happened couldn't be ignored or swept under the rug. As the days passed, her resolve only grew stronger. She realized that while the trial was about holding the officers accountable, it was also about something bigger, a chance to rewrite the rules so no one else would have to endure what she did. Activists and community leaders continued to rally around her cause, organizing marches, town halls, and educational workshops. People wanted answers, sure, but more than that, they wanted solutions. And she found herself at the center of it, all, not because she sought the spotlight, but because her story had become a symbol of hope and resilience. Her brother worked tirelessly behind the scenes, ensuring that the legal proceedings were fair and transparent. He coordinated with federal agencies, civil rights organizations, and even members of Congress to push for systemic changes. Together, they drafted policy proposals aimed at reforming law enforcement practices across the country. These weren't just ideas scribbled on paper. They were demands born out of pain and necessity. Mandatory body cameras, independent oversight, boards, stricter accountability measures. All of these were steps toward a future where power couldn't be abused without consequence. But change never comes easy. Critics argued that such reforms would undermine police morale or make officers hesitant to do their jobs. Some said focusing on individual cases like hers painted an unfair picture of law enforcement as a whole. Most cops are good people, one defense attorney argued during closing arguments. Why should we punish the entire system for the mistakes of a few? Her response came later that evening, in an interview with a national news outlet. Sitting across from the reporter, she looked directly into the camera, her voice calm but firm. No one is denying that most officers are honorable, she said. But when a few bad apples are allowed to operate without consequences, it tarnishes the entire system. Accountability isn't punishment, it's protection. It protects the public and it protects the officers who do their jobs with integrity. Her words struck a chord, resonating with viewers across the country. Social media lit up with hashtags like accountability matters and justice for all, amplifying her message far beyond the courtroom walls. Even celebrities and influencers joined the conversation, using their platforms to share her story and advocate for reform. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning. Back home, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Her kids still had nightmares, sometimes waking up scared and calling for her in the middle of the night. But they were healing too, in their own small ways. They started drawing pictures of superheroes saving the world, telling her, "That's you, Mommy." She laughed, through tears hugging them tightly. If being a superhero meant standing up for what was right, then maybe they weren't wrong. Her brother noticed the toll the trial was taking on her and insisted she take breaks whenever she needed. "You're doing incredible work," he told her one evening after a particularly grueling day in court. "But you can't pour from an empty cup. Take care of yourself. You deserve it." So she did. She spent quiet afternoons reading books, sipping tea, and watching her kids play outside. Sometimes she journaled, pouring her thoughts onto paper as a way to process everything she'd been through. Other times she leaned on her support network, friends, neighbors, and strangers turned allies, who reminded her she wasn't fighting alone. Finally, the verdict came. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the jury filed in, their faces unreadable. When the foreperson stood to deliver the decision, she held her breath, her hand gripping her brother's tightly. One by one, the charges were read. Guilty on all counts. A wave of relief washed over her, followed by overwhelming gratitude, for the jurors who saw the truth, for the prosecutors who fought tirelessly, and for everyone who had stood by her side throughout the journey. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted as the news spread. Supporters chanted her name, waving signs that read, "Justice prevails and change is coming." Reporters swarmed her, asking how she felt about the outcome. She paused, letting the moment sink in before speaking. "This isn't just my victory," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "It's a victory for anyone who has ever been told they don't matter. Today, we proved that our voices do matter, and that justice is possible." Her brother wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We did it," he whispered, "but this is just the beginning." She nodded, knowing he was right. The fight wasn't over, not yet. There was still so much work to be done, so many systems to dismantle and rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Hopeful that her kids would grow up in a world where they didn't have to fear those sworn to protect them. Hopeful that her story would inspire others to keep pushing for change. And hopeful that together they could create a future worth fighting for. The verdict was a turning point, not just for her but for countless others who had felt powerless in the face of injustice. Guilty on all counts. Those 3 words echoed, far beyond the courtroom walls. They carried hope, validation, and a promise that accountability wasn't an empty ideal. For her, it was more than a legal win. It was proof that standing up could lead to change, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. In the days following the trial, life began to shift in unexpected ways. Her story continued to dominate headlines. But this time, the narrative wasn't about pain or fear. It was about resilience and triumph. People from all walks of life reached out to share how her courage had inspired them. A teacher wrote to say her students were learning about civic responsibility through her example. A young woman said she finally found the strength to report her own experience of abuse after hearing her speak at the rally. Even strangers stopped her on the street, tears in their eyes, thanking her for being brave enough to fight back. But with the attention came challenges too. Some critics tried to downplay the significance of the verdict, calling it an isolated incident or blaming her for making things political. Others accused her of seeking fame or financial gain, ignoring the fact that she had never asked for any of this. At first, their words stung, dredging up old doubts and insecurities. But then she remembered something important. She wasn't fighting for approval. She was fighting for justice, and justice didn't need validation from those who refused to see the truth. Her brother reminded her of this often. "You can't control what people think," he told her one evening as they sat together on her porch. "What matters is that you stayed true to yourself. That's what will make a difference." She nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. The negativity would always exist. That was part of the world, but she chose not to let it define her anymore. Instead, she focused on the positive ripple effects of her journey. Activists across the country used her case as a blueprint, For demanding reform in their own communities, lawmakers introduced bills inspired by the policy proposals she and her brother had helped draft. Schools started teaching her story as an example of perseverance and advocacy. Change was happening, slowly but surely, and she knew she had played a role in making it possible. At home, her kids noticed the difference too. They no longer flinched at the sight of police cars driving by or panicked when someone knocked on the door unexpectedly. One night, while tucking them into bed, her youngest child looked up at her and said, "Mommy, are the bad guys gone now?" She smiled softly, brushing hair out of their face. "Not completely," she admitted, "but we're working on it, and I promise, I'll always protect you." That promise extended beyond her family. She realized that protecting her children meant creating a safer world for everyone's children, a world where skin color didn't determine whether you lived or died, where authority figures treated every person with dignity and respect. With that goal in mind, she decided to take her advocacy further. Alongside her brother, she